today, and then I'm hoping we have time to pour the floor. We're going to start out by wet sanding with 400 grit. I would recommend that you do some of your samples by taping a piece across. The customer can choose glossed or deglossed. Another thing that's kind of cool is you're going to see a lot of the veining and whatnot in here completely change its look. A lot of the surface color and what you see is going to completely, it's not completely disappear, but it's going to totally change to a very subdued green. It's not going to be a bright green anymore. It's going to look a lot more natural and charcoal. A soapstone, because it is a natural stone that's very soft. It's not like granite. They usually run it really dull, just because they know that if you do scuff it up, it's tough for them to polish it out. So epoxy, you get a really cool look with it. So I generally try to run, at least it ain't glass. I usually try to run a piece of tape diagonally. Be kind of thoughtful. A lot of times if you see damage on one side, you can degloss that side. I'll make it work. There we are. Went to the gym this morning. Obviously, as you can tell, I'm kidding. But I did go to the gym, and the whole time, some freaking douchebag kept staring at me all angry the whole time, and I thought, what the fuck is this guy's problem? And the whole time, and then I'm like, hey, what's up, dude? And he's like, you don't remember me? And I was like, no, I guess I fired him like 6 years ago, so I didn't even remember he worked for me. Guess you shouldn't be a douchebag if I remembered you.
Maybe still have a job.
Yeah. I actually remember, too, why I fired him, and I was like, oh, now I remember why I don't like you, so. He waited, though, to do stupid shit till after I paid to fix his truck and replace his battery and do everything. And after he got everything he could get, then he was in a little D-bag, so I'm like, that's pretty funny that you don't like me. I bet your boss doesn't do that. So, I'm going to start with some 400. And we won't wet sand if we have holes in the, so only, no, don't worry about it. Do we have 400 without the holes? Yeah, okay, cool. I'm gonna dry sand until he gets the wet paper. You probably don't want to wet sand with dry paper. Obviously, the deeper you cut in this, the more of a natural look you're going to get. You're going to take away a lot of that surface color. And as you can see already, as soon as I clean this, you see really bright green and you see very subdued dark green, and we're still only on our first 400. Thank you, sir. So I'm going to switch. The only reason I'm not wet sanding with these is obviously you don't want to be sucking water into your sander because you got the holes on there. The sander's meant to actually pull a lot of airflow through to keep dust down. So if you do wet sand with a dry, regular, cheap DA like this, and as you can guess why I have all these cheap sanders is because of you guys. So, so I have sandpaper with no holes in it, and also the particles actually stay bonded pretty well when you sand with true wet sanding paper. So I'm going to kind of demonstrate one full piece before you guys get started. miscommunication, I'm sure. Don't make too big of it through that in the top of your bottle. It might pee on your neighbor. You don't need a ton of water. The only goal, the only thing you're using water for, is to keep the sandpaper from sticking or gumming up and getting too much sanding debris in it. So if you see it start bogging down and you can't get the water in, back on the paper, just put a little more down. If you notice, you run it and the actual sander pushes in a clockwise motion, circles, and it'll keep the water in the center of the sander. If you go the opposite way, you'll keep putting water down and it just keeps spitting it everywhere. So you do want to be kind of clean. If you're in a customer's house, you don't want to be putting 4 gallons of water down in their kitchen. You could probably use one of these and it'd last for the whole kitchen if you're not being too wasteful. Another big reason to wet sand is, has anyone ever dry sanded, say, paint that's not fully cured? It gums up immediately because it gets hot and you can't do it. Epoxy is the same way. If you have 12-hour, 24-hour-old epoxy, it's pretty tough to dry sand it because the sandpaper is not actually like cutting the surface very well because it's still not fully cured. It's not a hard epoxy yet. So when you put water on it, it allows that sandpaper to cut it and keeps the sandpaper clean. It never gums up if you have enough water. So you can wet sand things that you could never dry sand yet. So if time's an issue and you're trying to hurry and sand it, just do wet sanding and you can wet sand something very, very fresh. Hey Dom, you're 1,000 too?
I already got it.
Okay, cool. Only one. We got a squeegee at all? Thank you, sir. Why do I want to clean this very well between switching from 400 to 800 grit? And if you know, don't say. If you're part of my people. Does anybody know why you'd want to clean the surface very well?
Get a large 400 grit. Get the larger particles off before you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it seems dumb once you think about it, but it's real easy to just switch up, like go from 400 to 800, start sanding. You feel like you worked really well. Then you bump up to 1,500 or 2,000. 3,000, and then you start seeing as it polishes, you see huge gouges, and you're like, that looks like 400 grit. That's because it's freaking 400 grit. Because little particles off this piece of sandpaper, definitely, even though it's a great piece of paper, do not throw these away. Keep using them. I've gone through $3,000 worth of sandpaper with one small class before because people are just throwing it all on the floor. You could use this, probably 2 or 3 of these would do a whole car. So, so definitely keep reusing them. But definitely, even though it's still good, several of the little tiny particles, there's approximately 400 particles per square inch on this, right? So some of those break off and are laying on the surface until you clean it very well. So I tend to wash it with water, squeegee it, wipe it down with a rag, then bump up and grit. I know this because I did it all incorrectly. I did a contract with Halliburton, and I'd never really polished out countertops before, and I polished the same countertop like 60. That was my learning process. I sat in this trailer listening to heavy metal and gangster rap, and I'm like, fuck, and got new stuff, and cleaned it again. I could never do it right. And I wasn't cleaning enough between. As you can see, it's already pretty nicely deglossed. Hey Dom, I'm gonna run through most of the grits here. So you might want to get 15 or 2,000. 3 and 5. gonna run them on these. Which grid is that? I'll need a rag too. This is starting to get pretty messy. You already notice a pretty major difference, right, between the gloss and the deglossed. This is up to 800 grit. 3,000 grit's a pretty common grit, but that's still very deglossed compared to a fresh pour epoxy. So if you want that same shine back, 5,000. But if you do run it up to 5,000 from wet sanding it, you definitely need to apply more pressure and take more time as your grit gets finer to cut through any possible flaws from the grit before it. But it'll be much shinier and much flatter than just poured epoxy if you do go back to a 5. We have some installers that polish everything they do. They wet sand everything. However, if you're gonna wet sand something and you're trying to bring back a polish, don't run it down to 400. I purposely did that to degloss and cut through a lot of the surface. If you're just trying to polish something and not change the look, don't drop it to a 400. I'd start out with like a 1500 and see if I could get the polish back, because the lower grit you drop to, the more work it's going to be to try to get that shine back. So I'm going to see if I can get the shine back. Hopefully not be embarrassed for you guys, because I'm not an expert at this. But I watched a few YouTube videos, so. What's that, sir?
What's the purpose of taking it off and then pouring it back?
Sometimes people want some of that surface sprayed color out of the piece, and it's actually really cutting. If you notice the difference between a poured stain that's just sitting, and after you cut it, you get a much more natural stone look after that. So, and tiny little dust, debris, imperfections, especially say you're in a job site that maybe your exterior or something, so you know some dust and debris got in your countertop. If you wet sanded with like a 1500 the next day, 15, 3000, 5000, you'd have an amazingly polished top, and you probably would never see any of that lint or debris. So sometimes you're kind of forced to do it just to get the final look. So a lot of times too, it's easier to take that time and paint your area off than sand, but you can do either or. Or say maybe it's a 5-year-old countertop and your customer wants you to just polish it anyways. So
then you're gonna go up to 5,000.
yeah. Are we out of power? Mr. Huh? We got 3 and 5? Okay, cool. Maybe the diamond shield. And we'll just keep reusing these. So. We got rags. Hold on, what will I do without them? Now you start getting up to pads, and you can get foam backed pads. Without foam backing, it has more of a tendency to cut because your actual sander is pretty stiff and rigid, so it'll like cut a high spot off. These pads are nice if you're not trying to contour and flatten a surface because it is foam backed. It'll kind of curve and follow any kind of contour, so it tends to also pop. So usually once I'm at 3,000 or 5,000, I use a foam backed pad. So they are a lot more expensive. Probably wouldn't want to run 400 with foam backing. I don't even know if they make them, but it'd be kind of pricey. So the back pad costs $8 to $10. So again, try not to just pop them all in the trash. Oh shoot, sorry about that. I did not realize you were. Try to keep it very flat. You don't want to dig into it trying to get something out of there, or else you'll have a really uneven finish. I'll stop this at 3. There's a full set for whoever wants to. Now, there's a good chance you're not going to want to go all the way up to 3,000. You might just go 400, 800. Obviously, I always start with the more coarse grit. The lower number is the more coarse grit, so. Thank you. You notice how my sample was laying flat on the table? I've been wet sanding it. See how it turned into a little teeter-totter? All that moisture getting in the back of unsealed MDF. The top is sealed, the bottom's not, right? So a little bit of moisture starts getting in there and you'll start warping your piece out. So I've never seen that an issue on a countertop, but you do want to think about, you wouldn't want water splashing underneath a countertop that you're constantly sanding. Okay. Now, we are going to apply something called Diamond Shield. It's a nano coating, meaning it's a very small particle that fills the actual small open molecule small open cured molecules in the epoxy surface. So
You don't need to wipe that down with alcohol or anything like that.
no, the best way is, well, probably wouldn't hurt to, but they always recommend doing this right after a polish. So once you polish it, it's cleaned everything off of it. So even if you use an abrasive polish, that's just as good as wet sanding it. So a polish obviously is going to clean it a whole lot better than just washing it or wiping it down. Surface off. This should be very clean, fresh epoxy. So, and I'm going to be massaging the into the surface. Very hydrophobic and chemical resistant, temperature resistant. Massage this in. You're not looking to do necessarily a coating as much as you are massaging this into any open pores and particles. And just remember, on a non-polished countertop, this will go about 50, 60 square feet. On something that's deglossed, you definitely lose square footage, but you will get a pretty awesome solid polished surface out of this. So This should be deglossed compared to my other side still too. I only ran it to 3,000, so it should be more satin. So don't just wipe it on and wipe it off. Take your time really massaging it and working it. And as you notice, I wrapped up my rag and tried to not have acting. If you have a big paper towel, you could soak up this whole bottle probably into one paper towel and you're not getting any on the surface. So that's why I rolled up my
Some cleaning agents affect the integrity of that.
No, not very likely. I mean, probably nothing you'd want to clean a surface that's for food preparation, I can imagine. So it's very chemical resistant. So bleach on a rag shouldn't be hurting it. Yeah, abrasive cleaners, I mean, if you're using Ajax or something, that's going to damage it. There's nothing that it's not going to wear out. I did a lot of countertops, and I saw old women that would use Ajax to clean their sink and their countertops, and they would totally just wear even Formica and stuff like that, clean out to nothing. So
Does this stuff work on like wood furniture or anything else too, or is it just down to
I'm sure it would, but all I know is that this is made specifically for epoxy, so wouldn't want to speak for its attributes, and it's not cheap. So, I'm supposed to be a salesman to tell you to buy it, but don't buy it if it's not gonna really work for you. Now let's grab. You know what? I'm supposed to let this wait 10 minutes. I usually just don't, but I'm gonna do that today because I have another piece to show you. I'm gonna do true metal here. All I do is a true metal piece. Obviously, this isn't 100% coverage. Poured epoxy down on this, or troweled my wall epoxy on this, and tried to brush in some stainless steel. So we're probably just going to have some faint polished stainless steel. I'll see if it actually polishes. Who knows? My paper back. I'm sorry, thief, paper thief. Kept giving it to her, thinking I'd never need it again. Yeah, I'll use this at 400. For the 400, I'll use this until I get to like 3,000 or something. Okay. It'll take just a minute and you'll start seeing the results. I know you guys are probably bored watching me work, but I'll try to get through this so I can answer any questions when you guys do it. I'll do another 4. because this is stainless steel. Sure, one of these. It's already starting to look like metal now, because it is. Make sure if you're trying to profile your piece that you do it all with the initial coarsest grit, which means say you have a high spot and you're trying to get through it, don't quit using your 400 and bump up to 800 until you have at least the profile, the shape that you want. A lot of people will bump up in sandpaper too soon and they to still profile it, and then they end up having to go from 5,000 right back down to 400 to cut the top off of a high spot or something, and then back to 800, 1,500, 3,000, whatever. And I know 400, 1,000 is probably not perfect. You technically should about double your grit. So you should go usually 500, 1,000, 2,000, whatever. Usually you can double the number every single time, if that makes sense. If you go too far, say you went from 400 to 2,000, it would take forever to cut through 400 grit sanding swirls with a 2,000 grit sandpaper. Does that make sense? So and I'm really trying to work out any of the grit down in the troweled low spots, so I'm not dragging that up through here when I start polishing. No, 800. Yeah, I think so. I might as well start another set of.
So on a day like that, you're not really trying to go down to a slick finish.
Yeah, and I mean I troweled this with wall epoxy with a pattern in it, so I wouldn't. So it'd take a lot to cut. You know, if I wanted this type of texture and I wanted it smooth, I would probably go ahead and take a plastic putty knife and squeegee countertop epoxy in here. So I filled in all the lows, and then I'd wet sand and polish that, and you'd have a perfectly flat piece with. But if you had any excess on top, you'd have to sand all the way through it before you could polish a true metal. So just to be thoughtful of that. What is the next 2,000? Okay. Yeah, I'll do the big polish. I'll polish it with the DeWalt. Cut your hand by spinning this on the side of the table, just so you know. Thank you.
When you're sanding those profile pieces like that, does the foam back ones get down in and like polish your blues and stuff a little better than the?
They really do. They work really well at that. So I like foam back pads. I try to do all my cutting with a flat pad, and then once I'm cut as much as I want to cut it flat, then I go to a foam pad so it contours more. So let me do this real quick. I just know there's some of that 800 grit down in all these lows, so I want to try to kind of clean that 800 grit out of these troweled grooves. No, just water. Be careful of adding too much alcohol to a fresh piece of epoxy too. Prior to a full cure, epoxy is not super chemical resistant. So if you don't have urethane or a top coat on it, just use water to clean it for the first 30 days. So 2000?
Yep.
Clamp. He's gonna bring me a clamp because one time in front of a bunch of people, like 4 times more than you, this kind of caught and the sample spun, hit me right in the wing really hard. So I was kind of embarrassed. So I almost fell on the floor in front of 50 people. So I tried to pretend it didn't matter, like nothing happened, and then I was like, oh, my stomach hurt. You know the rest. This is just a variable speed polisher. You buy it at an automotive paint supply shop, and no, I'm not using it the way I use it to sand. This is why Monica looks the way she does. Three. I expect one of you guys to be way better at this than me, so I'm going to kind of show everybody how, and then somebody else will probably really do a good job. Can I have a dry one? I'm going to go dry now. You can already see the start of a polished stainless steel look on this, and this is also very fresh, hasn't been cured for very long. It only polishes easier as time goes on. If you were to hit this in 2 weeks, it would polish up immediately. So 5,000. You can also use abrasive polishing pastes. Just remember that a lot of abrasive polishing paste, it says polishing paste, so people misread that and think that it means it's going to polish all the time. You could have a polishing paste that's equal to a 600 grit sanding disc. So sometimes I've seen guys run it up to 3,000 and they go to polish it out with a 600 grit. So they're totally deglossing it right back to where they started, and they'll polish it for days and they can't figure out what's going on. So make sure that as there's an arrow on the left side of the container, it says like ultra fine, fine, medium, coarse, whatever. You have a whole level of grit, even though it all says polishing paste. You grab the polishing paste by Meguiar's, that's probably one of the best. Flex also makes a 3-level system where they have coarse, medium, and fine. And it is also, instead of going to a 5,000 grit polishing pad, you can also use just a polishing paste pad, and always make sure that you keep that pad, especially if you have, say you're running their coarse, medium, fine grit pads, keep them in a Ziploc bag, and make sure that your coarse pad never touches your fine pad or that grit. The grit, when you're running polishing paste, is much more important to clean off, if that makes sense, because you're losing a few particles off of a 400 grit pad when you're wet sanding, but if you're using 600 grit polishing paste or 400 grit polishing paste, you're not losing a few particles. It is fucking 2 million particles on there. So if you leave one of those particles on there, it's getting rubbed all over, swirling it into your next grit. So polishing pastes, unless you're just using them for a final polish, can be a little risky until you get skilled at it. So I'll let you guys pass this around. I'm gonna rub the other one down and try to get the trim metal off. Here you can see this fresh stainless steel sample, cut with 400, ran up to 5,000. So obviously we could cut that more and get a flatter look. We could also wait longer and we can polish that a lot brighter if we did. You know, not. You do really want to watch more corners, and that's when I use foam backing. They also will make a foam pad that you stick on this Velcro back of your sander that softens edges and corners and stuff like that, because cars have body lines and stuff too that you don't want to wear right through the paint as soon as you hit it. So, but yeah, very good question. Like edges, you will go through an edge really quickly. A lot of times I'll wet sand by hand on my edges too. Yeah, it's so much easier to just run it by hand and not ever stress it. You can also use a fine steel wool. Say you have an edge profile that has like a double waterfall edge, something hard to get to. Fine steel wool, you can crunch it right down in there and pack it into the contour and run it with water or whatever. Just remember, it's steel wool, it'll rust, so clean all the particles off. The other thing you can use is Scotch-Brite. Scotch-Brite will contour an edge. A foam-backed pad can a little bit, but most foam-backed pads only go up to 320. So now I'm going to polish this off and see if I... Huh? No, I'm going to by hand. This is the Diamond Shield on here. So.
I'm going to do this on a wall.
Yeah, that would look pretty sweet. And that's frickin' bulletproof. We did something similar to that at the warehouse at their upstairs bar, and we finished polishing it like 2-3 hours before a party. The band was in there setting up, and they flooded everything with beer that night. Hundreds of people up there when it was still really fresh, and that bar now gets partied in several times a week, and it's holding up very well. And you guys are, I think we're sitting there for lunch today, so you can look at the bar. And all that was, it was troweled in a single day with a class. We went in with wall epoxy, troweled down our base because it was just planks. The bar was freaking hideous. And on top of that wall epoxy that we troweled over the planks, we troweled true metal right down over the top. And now they have a stainless steel bar, all seamless, their whole damn thing. It probably took 2 hours to trowel everything. So came back the next day and polished it and gave it back to them. So there just isn't a lot of systems that you could do that with. Now, in case I ever run for office, which would be a horrible idea, don't say that I told you to touch my wood, but there, touch this and pass that down. Doesn't that feel good? Yeah. Don't you love how smooth that is? You notice that what we sanded, and it's even deglossed, is way smoother than the shinier stuff right next to it that's poured epoxy. So once you wet sand, it's crazy how much smoother it is. And you just let ladies touch your stuff, and they're going to all want that deglossed. I've just been to so many home shows. Would you like degloss? No. And then they touch it. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. You're like, yep, told you. Uh-huh. We should call it velveting your sample. No. Okay, it's all your guys's. Don't get in McNigan's way. We'll help you out. Please be careful. Start out with 400. Be thoughtful of your sanding discs. If you see a sanding disc, keep your stack. So it's very important that you guys keep your stack. Run it from 400, 800, 1500, whatever, through the correct order, if that makes sense. So. There you are. There's an 800 for somebody. And you do not have to go down to 400. So.
Can I take your spot?
Yes, please. Who wants Monica? There you are. Yes, ma'am.
So are you guys just gonna sand this morning, and then after you get back from lunch, you're gonna pour the pearl and then the floor?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Sounds good to me.
It's still a little soft.
Yeah, so we can't sand it probably. Can you walk on?
I think
I did.
I don't walk on it, but I could still stick.
I like stepped on. Crazy.
Oh,